So my name is Aneta Rostkowska. I'm a director of Center for Contemporary Art Temporary Gallery in Cologne. And I'm super happy to welcome you to this evening about forms of kinship and ancestral spirits. This evening belongs to a whole project dedicated to different kinships, especially the ones that are being practiced outside of nuclear family, or maybe some that are could be like extensions of nuclear family. And we are meeting throughout this year, and then the next year there will be an exhibition and hopefully also the publication. My colleague and co-curator Chris Dittel will tell you more about the project. I just want to say that we will, in the first part of the evening, we will have a conversation between our two guests that I will introduce shortly. And then there will be a Q&A, and you can ask questions in the chat or live, the way you prefer. And I think there is a parallel Instagram stream, so for followers of one of our guests. But yeah, we never did it like that, but I think it will be great. So yeah, so Chris Dittel is actually a fellow of a temporary gallery this year. We have this very nice program in our region called Medienkunst Fellow, and she's basically working with me and with temporary gallery, and we have regular meetings and do research together. And she's a curator based in Rotterdam. So Chris, please
hi everyone.
Tell everyone more about the project.
Hello, welcome. We're very happy you're joining us tonight. I will just tell very briefly about the framework of this event, and which is a study group leading up to a larger project on kinship. And we hope with this event series to collectively speculate about various possibilities of what kinship can be, the viability of this term, and we want to think about what kind of relations we can form in the world outside of a nuclear family structure. And in general, we are interested in practices of collective learning and sharing, and together with the audience and our invited guests, we hope to kind of come up with some ideas and think collectively. In the past, we had a couple of events, most recently a reading group with Bini Adamczak on the concept of polysexual economy. We also had a workshop with Georgi Mamedov on the potential of dreams, and which was titled Radical Dreaming and Dreaming Collectively. We also had a seminar as a framework of this event series on the social history of the family with Professor Mi Yu at the University of Kassel. We also had a talk by Sophie Lewis on family abolition a few months ago. And if you're interested, some of these events, the recording of these events is available on the YouTube channel of Temporary Gallery. And there is still a few more topics that we hope to explore this year. These gatherings take place usually monthly, and please follow Temporary Gallery if you would like to know a little bit more about the project. But now I give back the word to Aneta, who will introduce our guests of today's gathering.
Yes, so our two dear guests are Khanyisile Mbongwa and Li'Tsoanelo Zwane. And Khanyisile is a curator based in Cape Town, not only curator, but also artist, sociologist, and she calls her curatorial practice curing and care, and I think we will hear more about it tonight. Her most recent projects include exhibition in Cologne that I actually saw, that she curated with Julia Herman for the honoring a decade of CAT, a residency program for social practice artists in Cologne. And Khanyisile is now the curator of the Liverpool Biennial next year, so we are all looking forward to this event, of course. Li'Tsoanelo is also based in Cape Town. She has a transdisciplinary educational background. She studied education and philosophy, and now she's a doctoral student at the University of Cape Town. She's also a licensed and practicing traditional healer, diviner, and clairvoyant medium. So I think maybe we'll also hear more about it this evening. Yeah, and we are super happy to have them with us, and that they found time and that they are together in this very nice setup with artworks that they already told us about. And yeah, I hope we can have a deeper conversation on kinship with you.
Maybe my last role is now to give the word to you, and maybe just to pose a question or a point to start with is to ask you about if you could tell us a little bit more about the relation between the two of you, which I think directly also links to the proposition of this event, to speaking about ancestral relations and spirits and how they help us to establish different understandings of kinship. And I know you are cousins, but there is also another connection between the two of you as healers. And could you speak a little bit more about that?
Cool. Should I start?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Be honest.
Well, yeah. Thank you for this invite. I think for me it was quite important to sort of think about kinship outside of maybe like adoption or queer community, and really like think deep about what does kinship mean. And like, because recently I've also accepted my calling to be a spiritual ancestral healer, or what other people in the rest of the world outside of Southern Africa would call a shaman, which introduced me to like a completely different or another layer of kinship. And so Li'Tsoanelo is my cousin, and I'm older than her in this material realm, but she's also uGobela. Gobela, in sort of trying to translate that, would be like, she is the person that I, on a spiritual and ancestral level, just told, but like I humble myself before her as a physical person, but also the ancestors which she walks with. She is Umkhulu, which translates to grandfather. So she's not my direct father. She's my father's father in the ancestral spiritual realm. And I am her grandson. And so as much as we are cousins in the material world, we are also like have another form of kinship through the ancestral. And I think it's better if you talk more about like the kinship system that is built within ubuNgoma and what ubuNgoma is a little bit. And then like the kinship system that, you know, talks about that forms not through blood relations that we are immediately aware of, but in other ways. So I'll give over to you.
So I mean, it's quite a complex system of existence. It's not as simple as like someone just being your parent or someone just being like a blood relative. It goes deeper. It's more beyond that, in the sense that you relate to the actual physical person, and then you also relate to all the various ancestral spirits that the person shares their corporeal body with. So if I had to briefly define ubuNgoma, and I mean, for me, I speak as an academic because that's my background. So I tend to use a lot of academic jargon, so apologies in advance. But that's how I sort of like make sense of African spirituality and all these different cosmologies of being. So if I were to define ubuNgoma, I would say it is the theoretical, epistemological, as well as the practical frameworks which inform the work of Izango. So, I mean, there are various universalities within the work of Sangomas, meaning there are things that can be assumed to be universal, in the sense that every single Sangoma, in order for you to be called that, there needs to be a very robust initiation process. So the initiation process itself, I mean, it can vary from initiation school to initiation school. So, but even though there may be differences in terms of the pedagogy, or rather the teaching style, because when you go through initiation to become a Sangoma, you go through a very robust rituals and robust processes where not only you are taught ways of coexisting with the ancestral spirits that you are sharing your experience with, but also coexisting with the ancestral spirits who are also part of the initiation school that you are with. So in a nutshell, that would be what ubuNgoma is. So it's like the overarching framework of understanding, where even if we come from various schools of initiation, but there can be various things which can be assumed to be universal. So in terms of our relationship, it's quite complicated. And even for me, I was like, what? So, I mean, in this plane, which is the 3D plane, as Okanye has stated, she's my cousin, and I mean, I take her as she's a big sister. And then in the ancestral plane, it gets inverted in a lot of ways, because essentially, I mean, as we are, I mean, we exist as women, but in the ancestral realm, we exist as men, because I'm not sure if you heard her in the beginning, she was saying that she's my grandson, and I happen to be a grandfather. I've never seen a grandfather who looks like me, but
So hot.
Anyway, so, and I mean, with that, it's not to say that my actual physical body is a grandfather. It's just in recognition of, I would say, the leading ancestral spirit who works with me. So her father happens to be someone who ancestrally is a son to me. And interestingly enough, her father is actually my older brother. So,
which is my younger cousin.
Who is her younger cousin.
Still.
So there are so many layers of being. I think this whole thing, even leading into this conversation, it's very important to have an open mind, because there will be a lot of mind trips. Like there will be lots of moments like, what the hell is going on? And I think that's the beauty of African spirituality. It inverts a lot of the things that we understand on a very linear and I would say cosmetic level. So yeah.
Yeah. So just to sort of take from where you're ending, like, so time, right? The African concept of time is, is quite intersectional. So for instance, intersectionality to Africans is not something new, which is in the academic world is like, I don't know, like this new big word that we just suddenly come across. Africans have always existed in an intersectional way through time. The past, the present, and the future are always intertwined. And again, this is a form of kinship, right? If you're just looking at this example between me and my cousin of like how in our corporeal bodies, we are somehow holding time in itself as Li'Tsoanelo Ngumkhulu, which is umkhulu wam, which is my grandfather, which means that we are not only existing in this, material time, but we're also existing in ancestral and spiritual time. And at that time, we relate very differently. But we carry that time into this plane.
Present time.
And have to exercise the respect and the decorum of that ancestral and spiritual time in this way. Like it might seem performative, but it's not. Like for instance, the term to say Gobela. Gobela is the person that assists you in your process of being initiated, essentially of aligning with your own ancestral spirit. This person is chosen for you by your ancestors, which means that your ancestors form a kinship with their ancestors and have an agreement that my child, when it is time for them to go through this process, will come to your child and you will intervene with your child to assist my child to find their way, and therefore we call this person Ukobela, because not only do I humble myself as a physical body and being, having to having to work through my ego in this plane, having to really work through my ego and humble myself physically so that my ancestors as well humble themselves to her ancestors. So even though she's younger than me, like she's a child to me, but because I understand, you know, in this kinship system that is beyond the physical realm, that in a way, he is older than me, but she is younger than me. So this relationship between like, you know, you are old, but you are young. So we move between this time, like time is such a fluid thing. And I'd like you to talk more about the fluidity of roles and gender.
So, I mean, there's a lot of fluidity. And even how African cosmological systems organize time, like how time has been organized is always in accordance with nature, and nature is never set. Like nature is a very fluid entity. Like, for example, I know in isiXhosa, because that's my mother tongue, so in isiXhosa we call a month impela nyanga, so which means that the moon, the physical appearance of the moon denotes that a certain number of days have passed. So there isn't really a specific element, and also how we organize time in African cosmological systems, that we don't have the pre-colonial, the colonial or post-colonial. So time has always been a very fluid concept. There's an element of fluidity. Even with gender, there's an element of fluidity. I mean, an example of that fluidity is, like, if I have to think of something just off the top of my head, because I also come from a background where my father, who is also a preacher, is also someone who heads up initiation schools, like when young men become men according to cultural rites of passage. So there is a particular situation there where, like, when they come down from the mountain, so each young man's family, there needs to be a young girl who is then chosen, who then goes and then adorns their relative, their male relative. And I mean, if you were to see how they look, they have earrings, they have bangles, they have all these amazing things. And it's so interesting that part of their journey into manhood requires a level of feminization or femininity. So which speaks to this idea of how in African systems, gender is a very fluid concept. Another example would be how in a lot of African languages, we don't have pronouns. There's no word for she, there's no word for he. I mean, the terms are very gender neutral. And that also goes with how we practice as Sangoma. So you can exist in this material plane as a woman, but you may have a dominant ancestral spirit who works with you, who lives within you, that is male. And then there isn't a categorization of, let's say, if you exist as a woman, therefore you automatically need to have a feminine ancestor. Literally, like, it doesn't go along those lines. And I mean, according the way our ancestors see us as well, they don't necessarily impose specific gender roles. So that's why you can find, like, you can be a woman, but then you can be referred to as ubaba, which is father, or be referred to as mkhulu, which is grandfather. So I guess it's very different to how the West organizes things. It calls into question how in a lot of African cosmological systems, how we make sense of things is not just what is what is visible
yes.
with the perceivable eye. So we have a different way of seeing. We have a different type of lens. We have a spiritual lens. Hence, there's always this fluctuation and fluidity along gender, and of course around spatial and time issues.
Yeah. I just want to like touch on that, like, because I think because we are in this material world, right? When we speak of the kinship as a form of sort of brotherhood, because we're using terms within the Western language, is seen as like very male oriented, you know, like, so within the spiritual and ancestral realm, like masculinity and femininity are energies that move. You know, it's not energies that like define your gender role. It's not energies that, you know, are very static. They're quite fluid. So when we're referring to like a brotherhood in ubuNgoma, we're merely talking about the genealogy, a way of sort of tracing in the kinship system, like where one falls. But interestingly, right, still, even though uLi'Tsoanelo ngumkhulu, which is my grandfather, many other people refer to Li'Tsoanelo as ugogo. And gogo is a more feminized way of referring to a healer. So again, in this wake, you know, there's this sort of consistent fluidity between like very masculine energy and a very feminine energy. And all of that for me is around care, right? Like one of the things, actually, before I go into my curatorial practice and how it speaks to kinship and speaks to sort of this ancestral, I'd like you, Dasekaya, to talk about the element of cure and curing in ubuNgoma in founding our kinship system. Like, what role cure, like ukwalapheka, ukuphilisa idlozi in a way, or uphilisa umuntu kwenzela idlozi liphile, to heal the person so that the ancestral spirit or spirits that reside within our bodies, in our plurality, can be cured.
So I guess it would be good then to provide context for that before we go into that discussion. So I would say, I mean, my first point would be the idea that within African systems of being, we don't work on an individual plane. There's no such thing as I. The word I is a very imperialistic term because it denotes a very individualized, independent of all other support structures. So, I mean, that is a Western Eurocentric way of being. So in African ways of existence, there is this emphasis on community, like a community existence, collectivity, collective organizing. We even have terms for it, such as ubuntu, which is the idea that someone else's humanity is very much interlinked with my own. In order for me to exist as a fully human person, that cannot be independent of someone else's existence. So within ubuNgoma, that I would say the founding premises of ubuNgoma would be that, to understand that even though I'm here and you may be seeing one person, but there are all these other existences that I'm carrying with me. So the curing and the caring is not just for the individual, but it's a collectivity, it's a we. So when you, in my work as a Gobela, and someone is going through, even in the context where someone is just coming for a divination, a practical example, when someone comes for divination, so how that process works is that in order for there to be messages which are relayed to the person, you do not ask the person what is wrong with you. You would consult with that person's ancestors so that you would be able to get the full understanding the underlying roots which have manifested themselves in this particular person. So both the cure and the care doesn't reside with the person themselves. It's an interaction with all the forefathers, all the grandmothers, all the ancestral spirits that have come together to make this person who they are today. So in a divination session, you would ask the person's ancestors to help you diagnose what seems to be the issue. And with that, in order for you to do that, you need to understand what that person's clan name is. So when you know that person's clan name, that is when you're also able to trace the genealogy. Like, for example, my surname is Zwane, but people who exist within this African way of being know that when they refer to me or when they recite my clan names, they can't just stop at Zwane. They have to mention all the other people that are part of my community of existence. So that being uZwane, uMangete, uZikode, uMntu. So hence, there's always this emphasis on community and like a shared text of existence. And even when you are going through initiation process, you are not initiated in a silo, you become part of another inherited community of existence. Because there is that overarching understanding that nothing you could ever possibly do, and you can never exist independent of your relationship from other people. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And I wanna roll from that, is a takazelo, like the tracing oneself through one's lineage. Yeah. And here I want to insert that, like, what that brings up for me in relation to kinship through divinations, that at that specific moment when uGobela is doing a divination session with someone who's come for a consultation, they have to establish an immediate kinship with that person's ancestors, right? Like, and for me, that links to us existing as a historical fact, right? Like, we exist, Black people, and our ancestors exist as a historical fact through which we, the Black people, can then enter into that historical fact and trace ourselves and trace where the woundedness may be, where the ailment may be, on an ancestral spiritual lens that then manifests as a physical problem in the material plane. Let's say a physical problem in a sense that, like, your physical body is ailing, or your economic state is not stable, it's always precarious, which is a very common challenge for most Black people, that our economic state is always precarious, which makes our conscious and our physical body always existing in precarious way, because we are always having to negotiate our finances, negotiate ways of survival. And so when someone, for instance, comes for a divination, and it's quite important for me to say this again, like, we exist as a historical fact. And this historical fact, we are the only people who can access this historical fact and trace ourselves. And in tracing ourselves, trace where the woundedness is, where the generational curse, And when I'm saying historical fact, I want to be clear. Our history is not colonization. Our history is not enslavement. We do not begin being who we are from our encounter with white people. So when I'm saying historical fact, I am moving beyond the colonized time, beyond the ways in which, the Western Eurocentric time is measured in a linear way, that, like, you are born and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. No, I am talking about intersectional time where the past, the present, and the future are always in dialogue in the ways in which we've explained, sort of discussed before. And so I want to maybe start going into curating and how my curatorial practice is informed by caring. And thank you so much, Mtasekaya, for laying that foundation and really opening up what ubuNgoma, how ubuNgoma manifests in our everyday life.
Yeah.
And how, for instance, African culture and African customs are not devoid of ubuNgoma as, not as a general practice, as a practice of like ancestral and spiritual existence in African society. So to sort of kick from where Li'Tsoanelo left off around cure and care and working really with the concept of divination. So right now I'm curating the Liverpool biannual. And of course, you know, the British did a very extensive job at colonizing and enslaving and building, you know, what we know as Britain today, the Great British Empire, from the backs of African people, BIPOC people from different parts of the world. And so when we're thinking about kinship, one of the things I've been experiencing while I'm thinking and going back and forth between Liverpool and Cape Town, you know, both in a way, I mean, Cape Town is a port city, but not, and Liverpool being a port city is being really not being ignited rather than triggered, being ignited by the ancestral presence that I have to care for in thinking through the kind of work on a curatorial level I'm doing that is unearthing spiritual and ancestral energies in that space. And how do I care and hold, you know, these ancestral entities, one, that were thrown overboard, two, that were enslaved, three, that produced the sugar, the cotton, and how they sit and live spiritually in the water that makes up the water that sits at the Liverpool docks. How does one care? You know, so curating for me is not devoid from my ancestral spiritual calling of being a Sangoma. It's very much part of this journey of unearthing, of unraveling, of undoing, but most importantly, of looking at the wound. You know, the cure element is really sitting in, like, my belief, curatorial, is that, like, we cannot speak of cure when we do not understand what the wound is made of. Right? So as uGobela was saying earlier, before they diagnose what is wrong with anyone who comes from a divination, for a divination, they have to first hear is Takazelo, which is their ancestral lineage, like who are they, where are they from, and then consult on an ancestral spiritual level with those people to understand the magnitude of the wound. So curating for me is that, like, in order for me to care and instigate spaces of curing and care, I have to also be open to doing the ancestral and spiritual work to understand, or not even to be aware of the magnitude of the wound the artist that I'm inviting into a place might be dealing with. And in order for that to happen, I also need to establish a form of kinship, a kinship with the institution I'm working with, and understand, like, what kind of relating are we building? Where are our meeting points? Where are the things that, like, we clash? Because I am coming from where I'm coming from. Like, I'm an independent curator, I'm a reluctant academic, I'm a Sangoma, I'm a mother, I'm a lover, I'm a daughter, I'm a sibling, I'm part of a community, I'm queer. And if they want to work with me, they have to take all of me and not choose the curator that they're interested in. And for me, this is part of, like, realizing that even within yourself, you exist as a form of kinship, that these parts of you need to find ways of relating to each other. And sometimes they don't work, and sometimes they work. And within spirituality and the kind of work we do, there are moments, actually, and you know this, where we clash as Sangomas, where we clash with the ancestral spirits that we carry, that walk with us.
And I mean, not all the ancestral spirits that we have are spirits that are genealogical. So, I mean, the kinship exists on multiple levels. So there's on a micro scale, and also on a macro. So on a micro scale being, you and the kinship that you have with your own ancestors, some of whom you do not even know, some of whom you've never even met before. And what is also very important is that we also inherit ancestral spirits based on the kinship that some of our ancestors had with other people. So our ancestors aren't only, or the ancestral spirits that call us to do this work, or the ancestral spirits that form part of our genealogy, aren't only spirits that are biologically related to us. So a typical example of that would be, like, we refer to idlozi Umdawe. So Umdawe is not an ancestor that you share a biological relation with. It's an ancestor that interacted with your ancestors, and they then formed whatever level of kinship. And yes, the kinship is not always loving. Sometimes the kinship is as a result of violence. So, because with anything that exists within the universe, there must always be balance. So if there was some kind of conflict, a wrong was committed, that ancestor then becomes part of your lineage in order for you to cure the wound, in order for you to heal or practice a deep level of care. So there is the kinship on that level where it's you and the community of ancestors, some of whom are not even biologically related to you, but they form part of your ancestry. And then there's the kinship amongst ancestors themselves. So some of our ancestors, so you have your maternal ancestors, and then you have your paternal ancestors who have their own relational dynamics. Sometimes they are not always in agreement. In good times, it's good. In bad times, it's not. So there's the kinship across those lines as well, where there is a kinship between your maternal ancestors as well as your paternal ancestors, and how they then try to navigate this space of wanting collective healing, because they are with you. They work with you. So the other important thing that I must mention, because I read somewhere before I came here, someone was talking about how when you are a Sangoma, you are possessed. It's not possession, because even the language that we use, like in Zulu or in isiXhosa, we don't say you are heard by idlozi, or the ancestor is heard by you. What we say is that unedlozi, meaning I am the one who possesses the ancestor. So it's not a thing of the ancestor possessing the dead. No, I'm the one who has the ancestral spirit. So there is that kinship between the maternal and the paternal, who may have various gifts that they want to exercise through you, or various rituals or processes that they may want you to enact, who may have very distinct ways of what the cure looks like. So part of African spirituality or African cosmological systems is that everything needs to be contextual, hence the fluidity. That's why a lot of things can never be static. So that's why even you as a traditional healer, your forms of practice can never be static, because you are dealing with ancestral communities of a different level, of different origins. Some may want a particular way of being cured. The others may want another way of being cured. Then there's the kinship on the larger scale, which is one's ancestors and someone else's ancestors. So if you were to trace African genealogies, I'm of the firm belief that all of us are somehow related. Because if you were to somehow trace our clan names, because so if I had to recite my clan names,
we have so many links.
There are so many links. So that gives rise to the idea that
we are from the same source.
We are from the same source. We have one common ancestor. We are dispersed, but we all get insight or knowledge from the same source. So there is also that kinship on that level.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'll touch on that. I'll touch on this idea of interconnectedness, right?
Yeah.
Which I think you spoke about earlier, and we're coming back to it now. Which I always laugh at this when Ubuntu is used as Ubuntu is used as humanitarian, right? And my challenge with that is that, one, humanitarian also means like that there are people who are not human, right?
Yeah.
We have been dehumanized through the process of colonization and enslavement. So Ubuntu can never mean humanitarian or like humanity. Can never mean that, because humanity, in the way that we have come to understand through the sort of civilized process of being colonized and enslaved, is that it has a defunct of dehumanizing, a violence of people who are not deemed human enough, right? Which Ubuntu is not. Ubuntu is really about this interconnectedness, which I have to mention does not exclude the individual. It does not, it still recognizes you as being an individual, but that is important as part of, as part of the collective, as the multiple. An example I can make is like how in African societies, in our societies, and even if I look at ubuNgoma, like what we are sort of using as a roadmap to kinship, right? Before we make the drum, we go into the forest and ask the forest to give us a trunk. And it has to do with a specific type of drum. But we ask permission from the tree before we take off the tree. We don't just take, we ask permission. And once the tree has granted us permission, we take the trunk, we headed home. We ask the cow for permission to sacrifice itself to cleanse something within our house, to be an offering. We don't just slaughter the cow. We ask, we speak, and the cow has to agree. And there's a certain way in which when we're slaughtering the cow, it will do certain things to alert us that it is an agreement with what we have asked for. We take the skin of the cow, we make the drum. We eat the cow then feeds our soul, feeds our body so that we can be strong. The same cow fertilizes the ground to allow us to grow food and to feed it. We ask for rain to fertilize the ground. Now we've got the drum, right, the trunk, and we take the skin of the cow to make clothes for ourselves, but also to make the drum. We use the drum to play the sound, music. We stomp our feet on the ground in ways to thank, but also in ways to express gratitude, to share our lineage. This is how, because our history is oral, we don't have a history that is static. Our history is that fluid. It's in songs, it's in the food we make. And so this feast that you get to see is an example, an exclamation of Ubuntu, that there's something has come full circle from the ground. We have manifested food. It has been fertilized by the cow that we have asked permission to sacrifice. We went into the forest to ask permission of the tree to give itself so that we can create the sound, to pay gratitude to the ground, to pay gratitude to the sky that gives us rain, that gives us sunlight. And so Ubuntu is this recognition that we are interconnected, this recognition that we in ourselves as being here are a kinship to each other, that we cannot without the other. And the most important thing, and this is why Ubuntu is not humanity. In Ubuntu, the human being is not above any other living thing or any other living source on here, which in humanity is different. In humanity, the human is above everything else. The human is the one that governs. In Ubuntu, the human does not govern. The human is part of the cycle of interconnectedness. Is part of the intersection. It is not, we are not separate. And this, for me, is an important part of kinship that we also learn in ubuNgoma, that in order for me to be, I have to align with my ancestors and align with my Gobela, who's aligned with her Gobela, and it continues. There's this continuation of time that sits in the presence of our physical bodies. And for me, you know, with my curatorial practice around care and cure, one of the most interesting things that has been happening, I think, in the last 5 years in art is the showing up of the cowrie bead. The cowrie bead has been showing up in artists' works everywhere. The cowrie bead, for me as a healer, is a very strong symbol because one, of course, we know it was taken from, it was one of the beads used to trade and to buy. And so this occurrence or like appearing of the cowrie bead in artist's work is again another ancestral communication. Our ancestors are communicating. And those who know will know what they're communicating, and those who are not supposed to know won't know. We know what that communication is. And if you're aligned, you will know.
Yeah.
And so this is the other component of care that I want to sort of express, is that in care, one, as a curator, I've had to learn to care for the sacred. When I'm working with artists who are making artworks that have sacred elements, my role I've come to understand is how do I care for the artist's narrative? Yeah. How do I take care of the artist as a person and what they hold when I am invited by an institution that potentially has the ability to violate and to create a violent space for the artist's work? And so which means that I have to prepare the gallery space, the museum space, whatever the space is, and prepare it and prepare the people within the institution so that they can hold the artist's work, so that the artist's work does not have to fight the system of the institution, so that the artist's work can come into the space and do the work it is intended to do. And so my role is to care, and that caring is sort of, you know, what's out of that, and to cure, like how do I instigate spaces for a curing to happen? And that has to do with like really sitting with institutions and first acknowledging that like most institutions do not have the language. In practice, they have the language in very beautifully written statements about what the institution does, but like in practice as a discipline, institutions lack this. And when I'm speaking about institutional, I want to be clear that like this is an invention. Institution, as the way we understand it, is an invention of the Western world, right? It is set up in very, very specific parameters that sort of defines and determine how we can move in space and time. And generally, I work with museums, galleries, and archives, and public spaces. And all of these spaces are very clear about the work they do. And so when they invite someone like me, who's very clear about care and cure, I always meet a clash, a tension. And before I invite anyone as a curator, I've taken upon myself, because of my practice that holds me accountable, both care and cure, care holds me accountable about my intention, like how will you care for the people you're inviting? If the institution in itself, for instance, museums, like if we're looking at museums in a British context, are essentially violent to anyone who's Black. Like the makeup of the museum as a practice, as a house that holds history, as a house that holds time, as a house that imprisons what I call colonial collections, you know, what I call, what's this English word? This very violent word. And then genocide. Yes, genocide collections. My George is going down as I'm talking. My ancestors like, we're tired of speaking English. Like museums that hold genocide collections. And so I have to be aware that like, not up until recently, have museums started like this call on decolonizing, but even that is challenging, right? This sort of the decolonizing aspect or decolonizing conversation still centers the colonizer in the conversation. And so essentially I have to be so cognizant of like, what am I inviting an what am I inviting an artist to? Where am I inviting the artist? What work is the artist making? And how will this institution hold the work? And this is why care is so important, not as an aesthetic, not as a performance of care, but as a discipline. And this is why for me it forms part of my practice. Like, how do I practice the discipline of caring? And that also means that like I have to be aware that like I don't have all the answers. Sometimes I don't have the capacity to care for the artist in the way they need to be cared for. And so I need to ask questions. I need to ask an artist, how do you need this space to be held for you so that you can do the work and the work does what it needs to do in the space? What do you want the work to do in the space? So it's also walking into an encounter with an artist and saying that I actually don't know. I don't know. And walking in as an unknowing person opens me up to receive.
Yeah.
Rather than like, you know, curators are supposed to know things. We're supposed to know things and we're supposed to enter as like knowers of things. But in reality, for me, part of being a curator is that like I'm curious. And if I'm curious, it means I don't know. And so I operate solely from a place of not knowing, of not being aware, of not understanding. And then, which means I have to sit and I have to listen. And this is the other thing I've learned about care and cure, and which I've also like has been magnified by my journey of becoming a Sangoma. The discipline of listening, of keeping quiet and listening and allowing all my senses to listen, my eyes to be listening, my ears, my body, like all of me to be listening so that I can receive, and listening without wanting to ask any questions, without having preconceived notions of what I should be asking. You'd be like, I don't know, so I'm listening. And so for me, this is, you know, how I engage with my practice around care and cure. And, you know, and sometimes it's challenging with institutions because there are timelines and deadlines. And I've accepted in my practice that, you know, the world is moving like this and my practice moves like this. And the world is like, da, 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 and I'm like, because I'm listening. And when you're listening, time shifts differently. When you are in the occupation of listening and keeping quiet, you also become aware when you are not aligned. You become aware when you are being careless. When you're listening, you're much more aware that like, when someone comes to you and say like, you have been careless with me, when you're listening, you learn how not to be defensive. You learn that, you know, like you learn not to defend yourself and be true to the moment of like, someone has been hurt by whatever, and you need to listen to understand where that wound is, you know, care. And to bring it back to sort of the ancestral kinship, working with the Liverpool Biennial and this particular project and that geographical location, you know, there's so much ancestral awakening that is happening, like that I have to listen to the ancestral spirits that were enslaved, that were silenced, that were thrown overboard on ships, you know, is part of the care. Yeah. It's part of the cure. It's just like this listening act. And like, I mean, you know, my cousin knows when I came back from my last trip in the UK, I got so sick. I had tonsillitis because my communication was being shut down. Because as my cousin has explained, as my Kobala has explained, that like, we don't just have ancestral lineages that are linked to us by blood, but we also have ancestral lineage that comes as umdawe, like the ancestors of the places, of like, so removed from us. And sometimes there's a tension, because those ancestors don't want us to communicate the reality of what the wound is, and so they will shut you down. And then you have to, because of this kinship, listen and call into your presence the ancestors that will open you up. But even that process can be very brutally painful. This is why care and cure are part of my practice as a curator. Like the importance of like care, and that you don't always get it right. And this is something I can say, like, when you are in the discipline of caring, you do not always get it right. I get it wrong. I miscalculate, I mishear, and when I mishear, it means I was not fully there. So all these things incur, like, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer, but what is important is that, like, I am searching for the wound, so that I can open up the wound and look at the wound and be like, why am I sick? Where does it hurt? Like, if we're talking about tracing colonial pain, I can't just, just the word colonial pain is such a huge word. I need to sit and be like, okay, when this is said, where does it hurt on your body? Tell me. And why does it hurt? Because we can't cure things that we don't understand. We can't, and kinship is an important aspect of that. Because when you have kinship, which is like a community, then you have other people who are also helping you look, helping you listen, co-holding the space with you, sharing like their insights on how they've done things before. And this is why kinship is important, because it also sort of highlights that something you've said to me, but that you are not the only one living in the terror or in the pain. The kinship is also that, like the brotherhood in terms of ubuNgoma, which is a genealogy, it's not like in a heteronormative sense of brotherhood, also signifies to me that, I'm not alone in this calling. I'm not alone in seeing beyond this physical world. I'm not alone in seeing things and hearing and feeling things. I'm not alone in this. There are other people who are also working through the nebula of this complexity and nuances of being here in this material world, but experiencing as well the intersection of time. I think, is there anything else you'd like to add? Should we open for questions?
I think maybe we should open for questions, because I feel like perhaps other discussion points can be prompted by the questions.
That's it for our conversation.
Thank you so much. I think if you recognize this or this ancestral connections, then you are immediately in a completely different like time scale, and it's really like it opens up, I think, a lot if you follow this with more dedication, all these connections. And of course they exist in many cultures. It's like, but we are very like capitalism has a very specific notion of time, so we are kind of cut off from this plane that you describe. So we have now time for questions. We have one comment in the chat from Sipho Kule Mathe. This description of environmental ecological ethics of care is so beautiful and shows that the historical fractures among people and industries are what has made it difficult to care for the earth. And then there is a question. Does Khani consider herself a midwife for artists in the same way a Gobela would consider themselves a midwife for initiates of ubuNgoma? If yes, I think there is a wider scope to talk about the ways in which practitioners of care are marginalized. Governments have systematically sidelined midwives to favor genealogists and technologies that biomedicalize for capitalist ends. Second question is, what can policymakers do to create platforms and spaces for African countries to re-educate the masses on the link between ecological environmental care and Ubuntu? The question.
Wowza.
That's a question.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think I've ever considered myself, Enkosi Sipho Kule. I've never thought about my practice in that way as a midwife. But I've thought of me being a curator as more than what the academic sense of curatorial practices is, and this is why my curating is informed by care and cure. I think at the very beginning I was aware that like it is informed by African practices of being here and how can I use this gift of being able to pay attention to detail and see things, aesthetic things in a particular way, and sort of my capacity to witness what the artist is reaching for beyond what we get to see as the finished product. And yes, I agree. The way in which I practice, I think many people have said to me, like, lives outside of curating as a practice. It does sit outside of that. And which sometimes is quite challenging because my practice challenges anyone who invites me into their institution. And so in a way, I become marginalized. Interesting, you ask about policymakers. One of my projects I did in Germany was around public space and policy.
Yeah.
And because I work with museums, this is one of my things that I try to get right with museums and big projects like that. How will they keep the legacy of care that I've introduced them to? You know, I sort of assist them in sort of figuring out how the institution can care. And so for me, in a way, that's like figuring out what the policy of the institution is. But on a broader scale, we do need different kinds of policies around education. But for that to happen, African cultures and spirituality needs to be demystified. And I think when I look at and this is such a wrong word, but I can't think of another word right now, caliber of spiritual workers emerging from the African continent and other places, is that it is everyone that we never thought would be, because we were raised to think that healers are people sitting somewhere in the forest in a hut, who dress in a specific way, who speak in a specific way, and our ancestors are busy demystifying us ourselves, you know, from the weight of that lie, because it's we carry the burden of that lie, and the burden reproduces this idea that like we can't see ourselves. And I think once we are able to see ourselves, and people like my cousin who is doing her doctorate, who will be at some point, I believe, in government around education, can be the people who like introduces in our education systems, can be one of the people who introduces like other forms of learning and other forms of knowledge. I mean, the whole movement in South Africa, you know, the Fallist movement, that we are both, I mean, I identify as a Fallist, I think you identify as a Fallist, was part of that, like to not even decolonize the education system, to emancipate the education system from the grasp of colonial thinking in a so-called post-colonial world. And to emancipate means that we acknowledge and demystify African practices as important knowledge sources for what we are trying to be in our everyday life. I hope that answers you.
Just to add there, like with the issue on environments, interestingly enough, it's something that I've also thought about, how a lot of our wounds as African people are also spatial.
Yes.
So, I mean, there are specific geographic places where lots of trauma and lots of violence happened. And besides the actual traumas happening on those specific locations, but also the process of being removed. So being forcibly removed and displaced from a place, I mean, it does interrupt with your indigenous knowledge archive, because how we make sense of our spirituality. And then Kanye, you gave a beautiful example of how the land is very much connected to our being. So if you are removed from that land, what does it say about your ability to care and your ability to cure the wound? So in terms of policies, I mean, there's been a lot of tiptoeing around this, but it's very difficult to be intentional about environmental or ecological frameworks of care when the majority of Black people don't own any land, when the majority of Black people are displaced. And when we find ourselves in spaces, be it home spaces or even be it in corporate spaces, because I mean, corporate spaces are also based on land, where even those small pockets of land are not accepting. I don't want to say accommodation. I don't believe in accommodation.
Neither do I.
They're not accepting. And there's always this emphasis on one needs to assimilate or one faces further displacement, be it financially or be it geographically. So with the midwife being, it's a lot.
It's a lot. We'll come back to you privately when I see but I want to also touch on this displacement and dislocation, particularly to do with museums, right?
Yeah.
And how museums all over the world, when we're speaking of museums outside of the continent, house so many of looted objects that I call genocide collections.
Yeah.
Displaced entire people, like they've got human remains, they've got objects, and this is a displacement, and there's and a dislocation. And there's been, of course, this conversation around like repatriation, returning of goods. And where I've been sitting with that, and it's around care, right? Around care, and it's like, but what you are returning is not what you took. Because if you've been keeping an object for over 400 years, it's been sitting in your presence in whatever way you have thought to care for it within museum practices. And so the entity is no longer the entity you took from Africa, from any other continent you colonized. It is not the same object. So what are you returning? And for me, it's been important to there has to be a proper acknowledgement of how the goods were taken, not just the discussion of we need to draft paperwork, all the institutional discrepancies which they hide, this displacement of objects which they don't even know what they're for, don't know who carved them. Like, for instance, a lot of museums everywhere around the world have an Nkisi object, which is from West Africa. It's a Nkisindoki, like this. It's a particular ritual object, and a lot of places would display this object. And I'm always wondering, what were the conversations around the displaying of the object, and that, what entity does the object now carry? Because it is for a very specific ritual, and what was that original Nkisi created for? So things like that, this displacement on an ancestral spiritual, So when we're talking about this ancestral spiritual kinship, it's not devoid from this displacement that occurs through objects sitting in museums. Right? This displacement that Li'Tsoanelo is talking about of being physically displaced, and this, I keep on seeing this image of a cowrie bead, and that this image keeps on, this object keeps on surfacing right now. And it is a conversation around displacement, and dislocation. And there's a beautiful line, there's a poet here in South Africa called Koleka Putuma. And there's a poem she has called Water. And there's a beautiful line in Koleka's poem, I hope I'm saying it right. She says, show me the compass that you will use, referring to white people, because I can show you the compass. It's along that lines. Basically, she's talking about I can resurrect the bones of my ancestors to be the compass to lead me through, because that's so many people that has been killed, that the water, the ocean is both a place where we cleanse ourselves, but also a place that is a graveyard, and this is our relationship with water as Black people. We are afraid of water, but we also welcome it.
There's a level of reverence, revering water as a knowledge archive.
As a knowledge archive.
And also as an indigenous archive. So when it comes to legislation, because I saw that being mentioned, when it comes to lawmakers and policies, I mean, if you were to look at, I remember I wrote about it in a chapter where I was talking about how the Traditional Practitioners Act number 4 of 2007 or 2004, I'm not really sure about the year, how it's very ambiguous in its terminology around traditional
Of course.
practitioners. So there is this dual complexity where it's like there's a very cosmetic recognition that traditional healing is a parallel health system.
It's a performance
but there isn't necessarily an integration of traditional healing practices. Like it's not clearly defined. It's interesting that when they talk about health practitioners, they are very clear that they are referring to people who belong to the HPCSA. So these would be like your doctors, your nurses, your psychologists. So they're very clear that that particular term refers to them, but then they refer to traditional healers in a different way. So there is this dual recognition, but also dismissal. So it's very difficult to navigate the legislative space around parallel health systems, and also making it possible for governments to engage with African cosmologies in ways which are grounded and premised by wanting to understand and also wanting to create an overarching health system where people have the right to choose and people are not demonized by, or there's also this fluidity, you know, because I do have a doctor, like I have a doctor, you know, I go to my doctor. So there needs to be that understanding that there are parallel health systems. It's not one or the other. I mean, both can coexist, but the coexistence, and this is why I have issues with people who in praising African spirituality, they do so in ways which bash alternatives. Because I feel like it's a very disingenuous way of empowering something. And to assume that African systems of healing and perhaps Eurocentric forms of healing exist in mutually exclusive ways are very false, because as history would state, I mean, even with Western-centric knowledge systems and indigenous knowledge systems, it would be very false to assume that they've never interacted. They have. So whether we agree with it or not, I mean, the fact of the matter is indigenous forms of healing have interacted with Western,
and
you know,
informed them.
There has been a lot of, so why then
cross-referencing?
Yeah, so why then continue to act as though these are two completely different things that must always be kept separate? Because we live in a very cosmopolitan society.
Are there any other questions or comments related to the topic of kinship? Uta, please.
Yeah, I have a question. I hope I can formulate it. First of all, thanks a lot for your wonderful talk and to making this clear that this spirituality is a contemporary practice and also a source of knowledge. And I learned a lot today, and I hope I understood also some of the things. And concerning this subject of wounds and trauma, I wonder, I have a special question, maybe also a practical question. If you think about the natural history collections, they're full of animals also coming from the African continent. And we just visited some for our research, and we were kind of also traumatized by seeing so many of them in this archives. And I wondered, when you talk about this intersectionality and the ancestors, in your concept, is it possible also to talk with the animal ancestors? And is it possible that animals who have been ancestors of humans? And can we also move in time, or can you move in time talking with animals that also have been part of trauma?
That's beautiful.
Or plants?
Such a beautiful question. Oh my goodness. And I think, so just off the bat, so African cosmological systems have a tired way of existence. So even though it may not be deemed as like organized religion, but believe it or not, within African spirituality, we've always had a concept of a supreme being. So there being one big spirit who is like the overarching overseer, the one who is regulating. And then below that would be ancestral spirits. Ancestral spirits as well as nature. So the emphasis on grouping ancestral spirits with nature is to also emphasize the idea that according to a lot of African belief systems, when one passes away or when one ceases to exist in the ways that we have come to be socialized into understanding, there is also a time where one returns, but you return as an entity that is part of nature. Hence this thing where some ancestors can choose to show themselves as water. And in some instances where people want to connect with their ancestors, they may go to rivers, they may go to oceans, they may go to forests, because their specific group of ancestors may be intertwined with that aspect of nature. And then below that would be humans. Humans, and also this can be like people who are gifted or people who are not gifted, but the idea is that people who are having a material existence. So this is also why when ancestors appear to us in dreams, they don't always appear in human form. Sometimes they appear as animals, and that's why in a lot of African cultures we have what is called a totem animal. So interestingly enough, I'm actually wearing one of my totem animals because this the cloth that I'm wearing is of a tiger, because some of my ancestral spirits are felines, for different types of cats. So lions, tigers, leopards. So sometimes when ancestral spirits would appear to you, even like whether in dream space or in waking life, although there isn't really a distinction between the two because they're always flowing into each other. So they would choose to do so as an animal, and there would be that level of recognition that, okay, this is not an enemy, this is not like a leopard trying to kill me in my sleep. This is actually an ancestral spirit that's coming to visit me. And what happens with that is that according to a lot of beliefs within this African spirituality is that based on your own ancestors' totem animal, like for example, if your ancestors, the totem animal is a snake or the serpent, for example, you become espoused with supernatural or spiritual powers where you can be able to communicate with snakes, or even in situations where you encounter a snake in a jungle in its natural habitat, that snake is not threatening. Just by reciting your clan names, you are able to connect with that. And then the other issue is the issue around displacement and the I would say, what is that word again for English? The demonization of practices, because a lot of our ancestors, they wore animal cloths, they wore animal skin because that represented something. So some of our ancestors, they, depending on your totem or depending like whether or not you are a member of royalty or whatever the case is, you would wear a particular animal. So my ancestors, they wore leopard skins. So with the demonization of African practices, they could no longer wear that, or they were not, or
could not hunt.
They could not hunt and they could not wear that. So instead, then they used, or rather now we use these cloths which are called amabai or amahiya. So they come in different, as a representation of that animal skin. So in the olden times, I would have been wearing a tiger, but because of how society has, what has happened, I'm only wearing a cloth to signify. So that would be the relationship with animals.
Yeah, that's an interesting, thank you, Ms. Sakara. That's an interesting question. I think I mean, generally, I always have reservations with museums, even though I work with them, because I feel like we have museums are part of like a huge human problem of like hoarding. We have this thing that we have to keep, we have to collect, we have to, we don't trust the natural order of the world to do what it needs to do. And so the National Museum is part of those places of sort of a continuation of the colonial project, in a way of like having to prove once again the domination of like the human being above everything else, by first like hunting down an animal as part of sports, and to show like our reverence and power and ego. And then after that, you know, and not allowing, still in a very same way that like museums trap Black people, like African people's spirits, by having like human remains. It's the very similar thing. And then taking this and not allowing the animal to rest, you know. And I think because it's animals, right, no one thinks of it as if like the animal didn't have its own purpose, because we can't communicate with animals. They don't have a language. We think animals are not sophisticated because they don't have this kind of languaging, which is completely false. And in our form of kinship, we understand this, you know, because we relate to animals as animal spirits, you know, like we all know as Sangomas, like, you know, besides our family totems, the animal spirit that speaks to you, that is invoked in you when you are in your highest power and like most aligned. And so it is it's one of the ways colonialism and slavery continues its project is through museum practice, and continues to displace us and displace our history, is by not allowing anyone to rest, and animals included. As I was making that example earlier about the ecosystem of Ubuntu, and Ubuntu being like a really interconnectedness, and understanding that you know, we don't have power over animals or any other living thing. But of course, in the National Museum, the idea is that we have this domination, and part of the domination narrative is inherently colonial.
I mean, added to that, what I didn't mention is also the medicinal properties of animals. Not just like in everyday traditional healing, but also in a ritualistic family context. Like, for example, in my paternal culture, so I'm very culturally hybrid. My mother is mixed, my father is mixed, but a lot of the cultural rites that I observe are Zulu and Sotho. So when I was fairly young, maybe like 4 or 5, in Zulu culture, we have what is called Imbeleko. So what Imbeleko is, I mean, the direct translation of that is your ancestors are putting you on their back. And it's also like an exchange, because you are also carrying your ancestors on your back. And so because they cannot physically do that, they cannot like physically or materially put you on your back, put you on their back. So in my context, a goat would serve the place, would be a placeholder for ancestors. So how it's usually done is that, no, but I feel like these things are important for people to know. And I mean, like, it's not, it's not an ubuNgoma specific practice. It's just how we do Imbeleko in my culture. Maybe there's another Zwane out there who might see this video, who might also understand how we do Imbeleko according to Zwane. So in my particular family, the goat represents your ancestors. And in order for it to be proven that you are the biological child of these ancestors, you would need to climb onto the goat and then hold on by the horns. So if you fall, then you are an illegitimate child. But if you are able to stay on, then it means that your ancestors have accepted you. And then once the goat is offered, then the skin is taken and then the skin would be sanded and then placed under your mattress. So in that sense, you and the symbol of your ancestors are always in close proximity. And then also as a symbol that this process has been done, you would then wear what is called ispandla, which is a piece of skin which you would wear on your wrist, which is a symbol that here is this goat that has served the function of formally introducing you to your ancestors. Even when a child is ill, there's also rituals or processes where animals are slaughtered as a way of asking for help. So yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? We're slowly approaching the end of our meeting, but in case you have.
I don't think
that's it. I think
there aren't any other questions. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It was really, I made a lot of notes. I will be studying, but are there any like interesting books or texts that maybe you can spontaneously recommend, or writings or authors if we would like to, you know, understand it better?
Wow.
Sorry, we didn't prepare you for this question.
We'll give it to you later. When you post, you just post the names.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay, that would be very good. When we I put a link to our YouTube channel, and there we put also some references. Yes, and I also put
one person to think about that I think is amazing but very difficult to read is ubuNgoma Mutwa. That is one person. It's very like but they also have like videos on YouTube.
Would you write the name in the chat?
In the chat, okay. Yeah,
if it's possible.
I think ubuNgoma is very challenging to read. But very interesting once you get into it. I mean, I'm still reading the same book 7 years later.
No, it's really great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I just wanted to say that if someone would like to follow this kinship discussions, I put a link to our newsletter. So if you will subscribe to it, you will be very well informed. Thank you so much. I really think, you know, in order to counter this neoliberal capitalism and all this everything what's going on and all this neoliberal art system, you know, I think we need some strong narratives. We need something to hold to get, you know, some energy to be able to carve some spaces of freedom in this art institutions and so on. So that was very, very like I think that was very inspiring, and I'm sure we'll be thinking more about it, and I hope this will reappear also in our other discussions. Thank you so much, Khanyisile and Li'Tsoanelo.
For having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Mas